Welcome to All Grown Up Now, a tale of retail, relocation, revenge, reinvention, reckless behavior, really good clothes, indiscretion, infidelity, domestic violence, and one kidnapping. I'm Kenneth D. King, podcasting from my studio near Union Square in New York City. This podcast is another in a series of installments from a novel I wrote called All Grown Up Now, A Friendship in 3 Acts, available on Amazon.com. It's the story of a small-town boy who dreams of being a grown-up and his journey to get there. Each week, you'll hear another installment of this story. I am pleased to announce that BearWorldMagazine.com will be one of the sponsors of all of the episodes going forward. In the last episode, Ken and Mark tangled with the legal system after their commando raid. In the meantime, Ken had his dream date, which came with a special surprise. Episode 27, titled, Gotta Keep Your Gay Card Updated. The place, San Francisco. The time, late 1996. One night, the director's cut of David Bowie in The Man Who Fell to Earth was playing at the Castro Theater. Since I'd never seen it, and knowing that a director's cut of a movie gives one more points when renewing one's gay card, I suggested to Mark that we go. He was game for seeing it, since with his recent background, he had little opportunity to get the required number of points to keep his gay card current. He was seriously in arrears. We ran into Jennifer as counselor at QAV and her partner Diane in the street before the movie. When I told them what we were seeing, they gave me a funny look, which I just interpreted as puzzlement about the gay card thing. Lesbians don't have to get a gay card. There's a special exemption. So here we were in this movie, which I can only describe nicely as interminable. It might have made sense in 1973 if you were stoned, but viewing it stone cold sober in 1996 was a different story. At one point during this torture, just exaggerating, I thought I had died and gone to hell, only to watch this cipher of a film into eternity. At that point, we were into the film for about 2 hours and 40 minutes when it happened. To back up, for those not familiar with the story, Bowie is an alien, what a stretch, who somewhere in the first hour or so gets involved with this neurotic brunette. At one point, she sees him without his human suit, looking all slimy and repulsive. After screaming in terror, she decides he looks really hot after all, and does it with him. Now, I'm sure this is the inspiration for the line in the Julie Brown song Earth Girls Are Easy, where she says, "He still was disgusting, but I didn't care." Later in the story, Bowie is captured by the government and is going crazy and fast. The girl comes to rescue him. When she gets there, she finds him in a bedroom watching a television, holding a highball glass filled with scotch. He's stirring it with a gun. Oh my God, I was horrified. I looked over at Mark, who had gone completely white. Bowie put the gun to the girl's head and said, "You know, I could kill you right now, and nobody would do anything about it." Appalled, I looked over again to see sweat pouring off Mark's face. "Come on, let's go," I said, pulling on Mark's sleeve. "Let's go!" So the two of us fled the theater in a shower of thrown popcorn and stopped on the sidewalk. I started apologizing. I felt like I had just taken a Holocaust survivor to a castration film. Mark started laughing, even though he was still shaking. Nervously, so did I. It was both funny and horrible at the same time, and I was glad that Mark had a sense of humor, even as he shook off the trauma the movie had reminded him of. And he had gone through some trauma, oh my God. In Mark's therapy to recover from his ordeal, Jennifer at QAV got him into a group of gay men survivors of domestic violence. This was good for him, but at the same time it caused him to face what had happened to him. There were times he would recover a memory during the meeting. These were times he would ask me over to his place afterwards just because he didn't want to be alone. He would just want to talk, so I let him talk. Remember the cycle of violence I told you about earlier? It seems that the first cycles are of long duration, months actually, but they get progressively shorter over time. In Mark's case, the cycle started out happening over a very long period, so he couldn't see the pattern. Later, though, near the end, before I went to get him, the cycles became so short that life looked like the spin cycle in the washing machine. The things Mark told me about what he had gone through during these cycles at Victor's hands, they made my head spin. Kuhav told me that when dealing with someone who's going through this ordeal, one shouldn't react to what is said. If one gets upset at hearing what the person has gone through, they may be reticent to tell any more in fear of upsetting you. The proper reaction was one of concern, but not upset. Now, this tested me on a regular basis. It was beyond my comprehension that someone who claimed to love someone else could do some of the things that Vic did to Mark. But it was also beyond my comprehension how someone could sit still for them. It was difficult enough to sit still while hearing about them. It was a thorough look into the deep recesses of the human mind, those cesspools where invention turns ugly and evil with ways to harm and torture. Now, this I contrasted with some of the supposed tortures that I heard about from some of my Idol Society customers. One woman, who I'll call Meg, used to complain that her husband made her drive a car, a Jag convertible at that was 3 years old. And she was limited to 2 trips to San Francisco from Southern California a month. She was obviously hard done by. So Meg would complain bitterly to me about the abuse she had until one day. I wasn't in the mood as I had not gotten sleep the night before because Mark had been up talking half the night telling me of one particularly gruesome torture he had remembered. I was raped with a loaded gun by Vic, and he had his finger on the trigger the whole time, Mark told me. Leaving his apartment after not reacting, I spent the other half of the night walking the streets, trying not to go buy a gun to go kill Victor after what Mark had just told me, so I wasn't feeling up to any nonsense I heard when Meg was on the line. She started in. When she got good and wound up, I stopped her and asked, "Meg, have you considered volunteering in a women's shelter?" "Why, no, but funny you should say that. My therapist suggested it just the other day," she said, totally without irony. "Well, then perhaps you might consider it. When you hear something like, 'I was raped at gunpoint by my spouse,' or better yet, 'I was raped with a loaded gun by my spouse,' it might just give you a little perspective on your own situation. I know that when I hear something like that, my life looks perfect." And then I slammed the phone down. There were the low points, but then again, there were the triumphs. When Mark got to San Francisco, we would go to the corner cafe. He hung out there a lot more than I did, as his schedule made that possible. In this cafe, all the neighborhood artists hung their work on a rotating basis. One day, I suggested that he might want to exhibit. At first, he was reluctant. It had been quite a few years since he had done any art, and he was afraid that he might not be able to do anything. "Well, there's no reason not to start now," I said. "You won't know if you don't try. Besides, you have trouble sleeping anyway. Why not do something you might enjoy to keep you company? It's better than pacing the floor and stewing." So he started making art. At first, I could tell he was very self-conscious about it, but as time went on and he built up some new work, I could tell he was feeling more confidence. Then one day, he called with an announcement. "I'm showing at the cafe in April," he crowed. "We're opening on April 7th. It would be 1 year to the day from when he left Victor. One of the baristas at the cafe was a guy named Bill. Bill was a nice enough guy, but he happened to be a heroin addict. Now, I think it's okay to be friendly to a heroin addict, but one is not friends with a heroin addict as a rule, at least intentionally. Since Mark was hanging around the cafe a lot, he got to know Bill the junkie and eventually invited him over to dinner. At the time, Mark was taking Klonopin, a very expensive anti-anxiety drug. I'm sure this fact came out in conversations with Bill the junkie. It seems that heroin addicts like this stuff when they can't get the heroin. So one night, Mark cooked him dinner, and the next day, Mark discovered a whole bottle of the Klonopin, which Mark was paying for out of his own pocket because he didn't have health insurance, was missing from his medicine cabinet. This caused Mark quite a lot more anxiety. Mark asked Bill the junkie if he took the bottle, and to his credit, Bill the junkie owned up to it, saying something like he did it to sell for some more junk. Sadly, he didn't bring it back or offer to replace it. What amazed me was that Mark still spoke to him after that, let alone still regarded him as a friend. About the time this happened, one of the guys from Mark's support group, who I'll call Charlie, needed a place to stay. He was changing apartments to flee the abuser he was saddled with, so Mark took him in. One night I was visiting. I did that a lot because Mark was a good cook, and he let me do my kitchen blonde routine without rolling his eyes, and the three of us were sitting around after dinner talking. I casually asked Mark about a date he had set up recently with a doctor, definitely a good candidate. Mark hesitated. I looked at Charlie, who was giving him a look. "Well, how did it go?" I insisted, smelling a rat. "Oh, you know." Mark avoided my gaze, waving the question away. "Oh, come on, Mark, tell him," Charlie said. "Tell me what?" I asked. "I didn't go." "And why, may I ask? Were you ill?" "No." "Well, what then?" Charlie piped up. "He was hauling Bill out of jail." "What?" I said. "And why, may I ask?" The story tumbled out that Bill the junkie had gotten strung out and was found unconscious, face down in a gutter somewhere, and hauled in as a nuisance. Mark got the call to help out. As Bill the junkie had nobody else he could call, what a surprise. Boy, that got me mad. So, you're telling me that, given the choice between going on a date with a doctor who was probably very nice and bailing out this junkie who, if you don't recall, stole from you, you chose the junkie. Silence. Charlie was watching all of this very intently. "Well, he needed help," Mark ventured weakly. "And didn't you need help in the form of that very expensive prescription that he stole? And did he offer to either give it back or replace it? I don't think so." "Well," Mark said. Charlie was still very quiet. He was no weatherman, but could sense that a storm was brewing. "Well, I'm mad now," I said. "And I have something to say, and you're going to hear it. Mark, what is it that you like about fixer-uppers?" "Fixer-uppers? What do you mean?" "Victor was a fixer-upper," I said. "I remember you telling me that he didn't even have a decent pair of shoes that wasn't duct taped together until you bought him some. You came from a good family. He was white trash. You enjoyed art and opera, while he favored video games and sex clubs. Your entire relationship from where I was standing looked like an exercise in ignoring facts and trying like hell to fix him. Something that you could never do, that you never can do. So here you are now, and you chose a junkie who stole from you, by the way, as a friend, and chose to haul him out of jail over a doctor who was probably very nice and would have treated you well, and if he had turned out to be a junkie, no doubt had his own source of drugs, thank you very much. What were you thinking?" Charlie spoke. What do you mean by fixer-upper? I haven't heard that before." "Oh, it's a real estate term," I said. "It means you buy something cheap that has potential, and you fix it up, you improve its value. It works with real estate and sometimes with furniture you find on the street, but not with men like Victor or Bill the junkie. There's no potential." "Mark," Charlie said, "Ken has a point. I hadn't thought about it myself, but that's what I was doing. I kept hoping I could make him better until he pushed me down the stairs and broke my arm." Mark sat silent throughout all of this, chain-smoking with his arms and legs crossed. He didn't look at either of us. "Forgive me if I sound like your parents, Mark, or if I'm lecturing, but I just don't understand. Help me understand why you made that choice," I asked. "Because, Ken, he needed help," You've helped me, and I want to help someone else. Bill needed help, and that's why I helped him. You yourself said that as payback, you wanted me to help somebody else. Yes, Mark, I did. But I wasn't specific about who and why. That was my mistake. So now I'll clarify it. I chose to help you because I knew that you were someone who would actually do something with the help. Your show at the cafe is evidence of that. But when you decide to help someone, it needs to be someone who the help will benefit. In Bill's case, you didn't really help him. You just got him out of a jam. There's a difference. He'll do this again. He's a junkie. He's a lost cause. There was silence from Mark. Besides, Mark, I helped you because I had gotten to a point in my life where I had built enough, well, for lack of a better way of putting it, capital, emotional capital. I could spend a little of the interest helping you and not dip into the principal. You need to spend some time to develop the principal. Once you're on a firmer footing, then help someone else. But don't dip into principal and don't squander it on lost causes. Okay, Mark responded. Okay, end of lecture, Mark. Now, what's for dessert? Then there were the times that Mark's taste for drama made me crazy. There appeared a guy who Victor hired to come beat Mark up. I found out about the first time when I returned from a business trip. Mark mentioned it in a casual offhand manner during coffee after picking me up at the airport, which caused me to choke on my scone. It seems the guy approached him at the bus stop and asked Mark if he was indeed the Mark who was showing at the cafe. Since Mark's show was still hanging in the cafe, this didn't seem strange, and Mark let down his guard. When Mark told him yes, the guy told Mark that Victor had sent him, that he would come back again and again until Mark returned to Victor. Then, in broad daylight, at a bus stop in front of people, he proceeded to attack Mark. What astonished me was that nobody helped or called the police. Since it was only hours since this happened, I insisted that Mark file a police report. One thing I learned from all of this was that if there's no paper trail, an abuser will hide behind the "there's no proof" defense. Victor's lawyer Pizza Face was playing this one up to the hilt, saying that Mark was making all of it up and poor Victor was the real victim. So off to the police station we went. About a week later, Mark came home from work and related the most recent ordeal. That morning, when he was getting ready for work, Mark looked out the window to see the very same thug leaning against my building across the street, swinging an aluminum baseball bat and waiting. So what did Mark do? He went out. I was so mad that I could hardly restrain myself. "Why didn't you call me?" I said. "We both could have ganged up on him, caught him, and called the police. Then this business with Victor could have been over. Guys like that thug wouldn't hesitate to rat Victor out if it meant they would get a better deal, and it would prove to the court that you're telling the truth." "Well, Ken, I didn't want to upset you." "Well, I'm more upset now. We lost a good opportunity to end this stupid legal battle. Between the two of us, we could have got him. Damn it." There were a couple more incidents which were duly reported to the authorities, but the police never got the guy. I'm sure that they get these types of things all the time. It is galling, though. But at least there was a paper trail, which I was grateful for later. These attacks were mentioned in court, but by Mark instead of Milt. As I said earlier, Milt had been fired because he still insisted on defending Pizza Face to Mark instead of the other way around. The legal battles that started with the restraining order were incessant with no end in sight. Mark said Vic probably thought that Mark would get tired of the harassment and go back to L.A. just to get Victor off his back. Now, to give you some timing, this whole drama with Mark and Vic played out during the time of the O.J. murder trial and of all the publicity it generated. One couldn't escape it, which I wanted to do because I had my own drama to deal with. Daily on the radio and TV, I didn't have a TV and was glad of it, we heard all the grisly details of how Ms. Simpson and her friend were brutally murdered. Mark and I didn't discuss it. The topic was too close to the bone for him. But of course, there would arrive the day of the verdict. Now, as an aside, I truly believe the children witnessed the murders. As someone who witnessed domestic violence in my home as a teenager, I don't believe for a moment they were sound asleep in their beds. Kids who live around domestic violence don't sleep that soundly. Words of experience. That they were kept from the public view and still are after all these years tells me just one thing. They fear for their lives from their father. Look what he allegedly did to their mother. Once O.J. dies is when we'll hear the real story. Just my opinion. I remember just where I was when I heard the O.J. verdict. I was standing in my studio, working on a project, when I heard it over the radio. When they announced that the jurors weren't taking any questions or communicating, I got a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I was dumbstruck, to say the least, when I heard that he had been acquitted. Acquitted, not innocent. To me, it was obvious that someone with tons of money just got away with murder. Later, I went over to visit Mark and found him in a real state. Obviously, he had a better understanding than I did about these things. He was sure thinking about the issue, to be sure. "Ken, Victor's going to get away with all this," he said in a small, scared voice. "He has lots more money than I do, and that's really what this is all about." "No, I can't believe that," I said, not too convincingly. I didn't want to believe that money trumps justice, despite the evidence of the verdict. Now, Victor wasn't wealthy, but he did indeed have more resources at his disposal than Mark did. Vic also had that lack of mental stability, which made him unpredictable at best and dangerous at worst. This lack of stability seems to give these people the persistence and stamina to keep going when sane people would have given up or resolved a dispute. A friend of mine tells me that there are 4 kinds of outcomes. I win, you win, or I lose, you win, or I win, you lose, or I lose, you lose. The first 3 outcomes are for rational people, but the I lose, you lose combination is the irrational outcome. When confronted by someone who has that I lose, you lose mentality, like Victor, know that he or she is crazy. The only defense is to get away as far and as fast as possible. There's no defending against these types of people, there's no reasoning with them, and there's no way of coming to any sort of agreement. This is what I was slowly learning during this whole hateful legal tangle. When dealing with crazy people, you just need to get far, far away. There's no predicting what they will do, and no fighting them unless you are part of the mafia and have no questions about fitting someone with cement shoes. Now there's a solution. In the fall of '96, Big and Dumb started calling Mark. Remember Big and Dumb, the child actor who didn't make the transition to adult roles? The one Mark tried to warn about Victor? Well, the predictions Mark made came true, and Victor had siphoned off all the profit that was due to Big and Dumb. No doubt part of that money went to pay the hourly rates of Pizza Face, which was what Mark feared would happen. Big and Dumb wanted Mark's help in getting the goods on Victor. Mark had literally run the business while he was still in West Hollywood, since Victor spent most of his time in sex clubs or otherwise cruising for men. So, Mark knew how the accounts were set up, where they were, everything. Big and Dumb's lawyers wanted Mark to tell all. Mark told them, under one condition, I'll do it. They had to put Victor in jail. If they didn't, he told them Victor would surely do harm, and no doubt it would be fatal. Big and Dumb promised to do just that, so Mark began a series of conversations with them to help crack the case. It was determined that he had gotten about $200,000 so far. A few weeks later, Mark called me at work, and he was in a panic. "Ken, they're not going to put Vic in jail," he said. "What?" Pizza Face recommended some sleazy killer lawyers down there, and they are saying that yes, he did take all that money. Now, if Big and Dumb doesn't sell the business and give Victor half, he's going to tell Big and Dumb's boss, and with the no-compete clause, Big and Dumb will be out of a job. "Oh, God, Mark," I said, "this is terrible. Give me his phone number. I'm going to call him." After I got off the phone with Mark, I called Big and Dumb. After a few moments, I got down to business. So what's this I hear that you're giving in to Victor's blackmail demands, I said. Well, there's nothing I can do, he whined. I need my job. Well, you should have thought about that when you started doing business, knowing that you had a no-compete clause. Besides, Mark tried to warn you over a year ago that Victor was robbing you blind, but you wouldn't hear any of it. Now you've not only lost your business, but you put my friend in danger. I think you're exaggerating, he said. Well, I'm surprised that you know how to think, you idiot. No, sir, that paying blackmail will never make them go away. It just puts them on the payroll. And as for Mark, know this. If anything happens to him, his death will be on your soul. And I slammed down the phone. And then I called up his employer to let him know about the no-compete clause and what was up. Remember Mrs. Thames? Well, she popped up as well during that time. It all started with a call about Gordon. She thinks Gordon has AIDS, Mark told me. Ruloff isn't allowing him to go to a doctor for any kind of treatment. He says he can handle things because he's a nurse. Sounds like he wants to snatch the house and the bank accounts, I said. Don't they have marriage for gays there? No, Mark said. There's a will, though, and Ruloff stands to get the house, all the art, the jewelry, and the bank accounts. So he has a reason not to get Gordon to a doctor. So what did you say to her? I asked. Well, what could I say, he said. I told her about the new drugs to combat AIDS, the protease inhibitors, but Gordon has to be here to get them. She, of course, wants to talk to her daughter, who's a nurse in Texas, all about this. Texas, the center of the universe when it comes to AIDS research. A few days later, Mrs. Thames called back. She was more insistent this time that Mark help her out. Mark told me of the phone conversation over dinner at his place that evening. Well, fuck her, I said. She has one hell of a nerve. When you needed her help, all she could do was make excuses. She didn't want to get involved. But she needs help, Mark said. And this time, Mark, if you help her, it will cost her. She's gotten the free ride long enough. Ken, she wants me to go to the Netherlands to try to talk Gordon into coming back to the States, but I don't think he could be convinced as long as Ruloff is there. Well, doll, I said, we could kidnap him, kind of like I did with you. It would be a little more complicated, crossing the international date line and all that, but we could do it. But not until you see a briefcase with $50,000 in cash and all of our expenses. That cash could be your nest egg. You're serious, Mark said, and he was giving me the eyebrow. Sure I am, I said. We could do it. Now, let's see. In the movies, for something like this, they would call Interpol. Call Ace the Gumshoe and ask him about Interpol. See if it's a real thing and how he would pull this one off. I'm sure we would need someone who spoke the language to meet us there, and a car and all that, but we could do it. Ace will know how to arrange it. Besides, it's one of the expenses. But, Mark, I want to see that briefcase full of cash. I think that would be a very cool sight. So, over the next few days, Mark made calls to Ace the Gumshoe and then Mrs. Thames. Mark felt this was a good time to do it for a lot of reasons. First, Victor had been calling him, threatening again after Big and Dumb paid off. Mark would be out of town for a while, far, far away, out of Victor's reach. Second, it was nearing Christmas, and that was a good cover for the visit. We would buy lots of presents to bring Gordon and Ruloff, and nobody would refuse friends who showed up at the house unexpectedly with armloads of gifts. That would get us in. We would have some expendable luggage and clothes, as we would eventually be leaving everything there when we snatched Gordon so as not to arouse suspicion. Once we were in, we would take Gordon out alone for drinks or shopping and get him to go with us. Mrs. Thames could arrange for a new passport for him, as he would no doubt have one on him when we snatched him. She could also get a private plane. She had connections to do that. It could work. Mark made the final phone call to Mrs. Thames one evening, and I sat in his living room while he was talking. From the one side of the conversation I was hearing, it sounded like they were having second thoughts. It took a while, but eventually Mark got off the phone with a bewildered and somewhat horrified look on his face. "They're going to let him die," he said quietly. "Oh no, Mark. Yes, they didn't come out and say it in so many words, but between the lines, they said that if they brought him back home, they then would have to deal with the monster they had created, throwing money at him all those years. Mrs. Thames claimed that they didn't have the money, but I know she does in an account she keeps in Saskatchewan, an account I reminded her of while I was on the phone. I had wondered about that comment, but what Mrs. Thames didn't know was by this time Mark had a better job working on the online banking department at Wells Fargo. He worked the phones on the late shift, so it was really easy to snoop in his spare time. That's how he discovered that little tidbit. Mrs. Thames had $1.5 million in the Saskatchewan account. That bitch. In the next episode, the most normal evening in the world. Thanks for listening. I'd like to thank BearWorldMagazine.com for sponsoring this podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Play. If you have questions, you can reach me through the website allgrownupnow.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Kenneth D. King, on Facebook at Kenneth D. King Design, or on my main website, KennethDKing.com.